So, good evening, folks. And today we have a guest, a very special guest. We have finally had the opportunity to connect with a woman who has intimate experience with the prison industrial complex from the inside as someone who has done time. Today we have with us Joybelle Phelan. She is currently recreating her life as she moves forward in new directions. She is committed to being authentic, creative, and living a life of integrity after spending multiple years incarcerated. She seeks to empower others and build a community of people walking a path of personal responsibility and growth. She regrets the decisions she has made in the past that caused harm, but firmly believes in the power of redemption. She is grateful for the lessons she's learned and is open to continued transformation. She is passionate about writing, empowering the world around her, and criminal justice reform on a national level. Joybelle Phelan, thank you for dropping in with us today. And how are you, ma'am?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. I'm currently, right this moment, in a halfway house. So I'm navigating what that transition looks like. I was just released from prison right before Christmas. So it's been a couple of months of, I was in for 4.5 years this time on my second incarceration. And even without a global pandemic, the world would be different. And so I'm just sort of navigating what that looks like now.
Well, congratulations and welcome home.
Thank
We're
you.
glad to have you back out in the world. So you're coming back out now after doing 4.5 years and stepping into the middle of a pandemic and having to go through a halfway house, transitional house. What's that like?
Sometimes it's overwhelming, to be honest. Navigating, Zoom was entirely new to me. So these Zoom meetings, just navigating the technology, right? And I'm one of the lucky ones because I was gifted with a Chromebook, a cell phone. I had a job waiting for me. So I fully recognize that I am blessed, but I shouldn't be one of the lucky ones, right? Like everybody should have these opportunities, and often they don't, right?
So what are the opportunities or lack of opportunities that you make reference to that many don't have that you had?
Well, so I'm a pretty proactive kind of girl, right? I believe in doing work for myself. And so I did a lot of programs while I was inside, and I stayed in contact with those people. And so I was lucky enough to work that network, right? And reach out for reentry help. So I worked with an organization called Defy Colorado that went to their vendors and their sponsors and fundraised a reentry pack. So they paid for my phone for 3 months. They gave me a Chromebook. Like I wouldn't have been able to afford that. I did cosmetology while I was inside. So I had a woman come inside the prison who formerly incarcerated herself, who was now a successful general manager at a Great Clips franchise. I had a job waiting for me. As long as I communicated with her, I had a job as soon as I got out. A lot of people, and cutting hair, right? That's a good job. A lot of people don't have that, especially in the halfway house. It's a lot of fast food, a lot of retail. And there's nothing wrong with those jobs, right? But it's who do you know? If you don't have a resume, if you don't have job skills, if you don't have a support system, it can be really hard to find a job.
Mhm, mhm.
And how do you pay rent? Like the minute I got here, I owed rent. So without
Yeah,
a job, I'm behind on my rent.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it can definitely be a daunting endeavor for anyone, especially someone coming out after several years of incarceration. But let's rewind the tape a little bit and get more into Joybelle. Tell us about who you are, where you come from. What was your childhood like?
So I'm a Colorado native, proud to be. I've lived here all my life and love it. I was raised in the suburbs of a town called Arvada. Growing up in a fairly typical dysfunctional household like everybody else on earth, right? Dad was an auto mechanic, mom was a stay-at-home mom, had an older brother. He was the athlete, I was the reader and the musician. thought I had a fairly typical life, right? Like everybody else. My household was chaotic and abusive. Um, I'm an adopted child, so I've really all of my life struggled with worth issues and feeling connected. It's so funny, ironic now. Um, I desperately love connection. I love having deep conversations and hearing about people's journeys and stories and transformation. But all of my life, I've been scared to death of that push pull of wanting it but afraid of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was raised, in a typical, we went camping and fishing, and dad built hot rods. So I love cars, right? Um, we used to go to stock car races when I was a kid. But also mom was from the East Coast. So I love musicals, and I'm a talented singer, and I played multiple instruments as a child. So very musical and sort of the typical Western, what you think of Colorado. I got to have both of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Went to high school, I honestly did not get into any sort of legal trouble until I was well into my 30s. I had a typical kid, right? Went to school, had friends, went to church, like did all of that typical stuff. And obviously as a kid, I didn't know that what was happening at home, the violence and the abuse. I mean, I thought everybody had that, right? We do as kids, right? We think everybody has the same life we do. But it was rough. It was like everybody else, dysfunctional and toxic. I actually have not had contact with my adopted family in more than 15 years by choice. I cut them out of my life on purpose. It was too toxic. I couldn't do it. It just wasn't healthy for me. I've been lucky enough. I've found my biological mom and a half sister a few years ago, and we're developing a relationship now, but that's still new, right? We're still figuring out what that looks like. So I don't have a lot of family support. I have a fiance who's amazing. He's a great man, very supportive, supported me through my entire incarceration this last time. But it's a lot for someone that hasn't been in that space. And I'm very passionate about shining a light on what it's like to be a woman incarcerated. Not a lot of women tell their stories for whatever reason. And I believe it's important to tell our stories. And the world can't change if people don't know what happens behind bars.
Mm-hmm. So, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for being willing to come on here and be vulnerable and share your story, and help educate people, kind of to what goes on behind the wizard's curtain. So I'm positive our listeners would be interested, and they're probably sitting on the edge of their seats. What led you to incarceration? What led you to prison? Someone who, raised in the suburbs and might have had a childhood that was, less than perfect, but you mentioned you didn't have any run-ins with the law until into your 30s. What led you into contact with the law enforcement?
So my crimes are all felony theft. Right this minute, I owe $500,000 in restitution before interest. My worth issues really drove picking incredibly wrong relationships. I believed that I was not worthy. I believed that I had to buy my friends. I had to buy relationships. And so I was paying for stuff that I never should have been, right? I was married to my second husband, who I never should have been married to, just because he was an addict himself. And he was violent. And he couldn't hold a job. And after several years, we had a house, right? And he couldn't keep a job. And I had a bookkeeping business. I was trying to start my own business, and I'm very entrepreneurial minded. So working for other people was not always, there's nothing wrong with that. But for me in my space, I preferred to work for myself. And we got to the point where couldn't keep a roof over our head. And I originally began stealing money from a client that I worked for, a doctor, to pay our mortgage. And as anyone else who's ever gotten into addictive or criminal thinking, once you do it and get away with it, it becomes easier. And over time, it became easy to rationalize in my own mind, well, it's a crisis. Oh, we need tires for the car. We need food on the table. We need to pay the mortgage. And because I came from an abusive home, like I thought that was normal. I thought that's just what you did. And my own worth issues drove, well, I have to do, if I don't do this, he won't love me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think anyone who's been in a not healthy relationship can probably identify with that. You lessen yourself and you make choices that in a healthy mind you never would make, but you think you have to, and you don't know any different. And so I stole money to fund our lifestyle, and then I stole money after his abuse really escalated and he beat the window of a car parked in front of our house. That was sort of the last straw. So then I stole money to rent an apartment and move out and to divorce him. Excuse me. And then I continued to steal money to take care of myself because I had no other help. It was just me. And after a while, you absolutely begin to rationalize, well, just this once. And I could never do just this once, because then some other quote unquote crisis would pop up and I would need money for something. And so, in a way, as messed up as this sounds, I'm grateful to have gone to prison because nothing else was going to stop me from stealing money, because something always came up that I needed to do that. And my own worth issues were such that I continued to get into relationships with not the right people.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds like a hell of a carousel, and without any guidance or direction or blueprint, there's really no feasible means of exiting that ride.
Right. There's not. And
Yeah.
you don't know what you don't know. And I always wanted connection, but I was afraid of it. Right. And so I didn't know how to be vulnerable, and I didn't know how to be open, and I didn't know how to ask for help. And I didn't feel like I had anybody I could ask for help from. And
Mhm.
no one knew what I was doing. Nobody in my life, my own husband, nobody knew that I was stealing huge sums of money to fund a lifestyle,
Mhm.
because I couldn't tell anybody, number one, for the shame, and number two, well, that would put them in a horrible position of, well, do I tell? Right? I'm engaging in criminal behavior. Like, you don't tell anybody what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm assuming you got arrested.
Yes, I got away with it for more than 4 years from the doctor's office that I worked for. And I actually stopped working for him, had moved on, and they found it. I'm assuming, I don't know obviously, but I'm assuming that their CPA found it at some point. And yes, and so here gets even more awkward. So when the police came to my door, I had contact with the police. So in the meantime, after I divorced that guy, the next guy I got involved with was on parole. So I had all of a sudden some exposure to what a parole system looks like, right? For a parole sponsor. This guy had serious addiction problems. Like, I never should have been involved with him either. Well, he got violent. And so at the point where the police came to arrest me, they had been at my home very recently because of a domestic violence situation. This man, we had been going back and forth in his addiction roller coaster, and he would not leave one night. It was not on my lease, did not live there, but had shown up high, threatening me, scaring me. I finally got away from him, and the police went to arrest him, and he resisted arrest. And it ended up being a domestic violence situation, and he went to jail that night. I think it was maybe a week later they came to arrest me, and one of the same officers who had been
Mm.
there that night at the DV was there that night to arrest me. And I had never been arrested before. I had never spent a night. I was scared to death. I had no idea what was happening. Like, I had never been on that end of the situation, right? And it was frightening.
Yeah. Well, what was that like?
Frightening. It was, I believe that the officers that night were as kind to me as they could be. I mean, of course, I was handcuffed, of course. And it was, Lord, sometime in the middle of the night, like it was maybe around midnight when they came knocking at my apartment door. They allowed me to put on a coat. Obviously, I wasn't dressed, right? I had been in bed. So they let me get a little bit dressed. They gave me a coat. They kind of advised me on, just take your ID, don't take a lot of stuff with you. Um, and so I went to jail that night and was booked through, got fingerprinted and, all of that processing stuff that, you know, maybe some of your listeners are familiar with. Others aren't. And it's, you're in a cold concrete cell. You are stripped naked and searched. And if you've never had that happen to you, I hope you never do if you haven't had it happen to you, but it's incredibly humiliating and violating and demoralizing, and it's a rough thing to have to go through, especially if it's your first experience in the system. You have no idea what's happening and nobody explains anything to you, right? They assume you've been here before and you know the deal and you know the drill. And so if you're scared and crying and confused, they don't much care.
Yeah, I can definitely resonate with the being dehumanized aspect of the strip search process, and having whatever shreds of dignity may be there, completely stripped away. And so for some, and I was somebody who, considered myself a criminal, who considered myself, a quote unquote gangster in the underworld venues. And so cops and robbers for me was a part of the game. Play the game, you get caught, you go to jail, you get out, and try not to get caught, the next time. And what I'm hearing is the story of someone who just on the surface would appear to be a middle class white woman, and here's your introduction into the system. Now you're in the big house.
Yep, that's accurate. Yep, that's accurate.
And so what is going through your body? What are you experiencing emotionally as you're going through this process and starting to, receive your charges and get educated as to, what it is you're looking at, and thinking about what your life is like now? What's going on inside of you now?
It's definitely a lot of, oh shit. What, like, really, I had never, so I had that boyfriend that I referred to. So I had heard some of his stories about what, male prison and female prison are two vastly different worlds. For anyone that doesn't know that, they are. And so I had heard some of his stories about how violent jail can be, about how it's racially segregated. And I believe that's true for men's facilities. Women's facilities, that's not how that works. They are not kept racially segregated. They are not kept, that has not been my experience. Maybe it is in some other states, but that hasn't been my experience. And so that first night in jail, it was the middle of the night by the time I got there. I didn't understand where do you get bedding? How do you make your bed? And you have to be quiet because everybody else is sleeping. And oh my God, what's going to happen if I accidentally drop something or wake somebody up? And so definitely on the outside, like me personally, I appear very stoic. I maintain calm. And so on the outside, I look like I'm okay. But on the inside, I can't eat. I'm not sleeping. I'm trying really hard not to cry because from what my boyfriend had told me, showing any sort of fear or weakness, like even I know you don't, put blood in the water for the sharks to come around, right? Like you have to present the facade that you're tough, that you have it all together, and that you're not someone to be messed with. Well, that's not who I really am, right? But I'm definitely feeling like that's the facade I need to present. And I have no idea what's happening. Like, when am I going to be allowed? And it was, I remember because you do get that one phone call that you see on TV, right?
Mhm.
And I had nobody to call. And the sense of complete and total isolation, and nobody cares where I am. Like even right now, I can feel the emotion behind that and feeling so alone. And what's going to happen to me? And if I, God forbid, something happens in this jail and I'm hurt, nobody knows and nobody's going to care.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's sad. And I can feel it, coming through the screen now. I can feel the sadness.
Yeah, even
Hmm.
now. And that was, oh, good Lord, that was in 2011,
Mhm.
right? So how many years now, right? We're 10 years away from that. And I'm still I still have, like, describing that to you, I still feel that I'm still, holding back tears. There's still an emotional hit there 10 years later.
Mhm. Mhm. And where, if you can identify it, where in your body do you feel that emotional hit right now?
Um, in my chest, absolutely.
Mhm. Mhm. Do you feel it often?
Not often. I would like to think I've done a better job in learning how to become open and vulnerable and being willing to share. And I do have people in my life that love me. Like if this happened today, I have someone I could call, right? I have friends that would care, that would want to know what was happening with me. So I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago. And I think I've done, I hope, a better job of letting the people that I love in my life, I would hope that I've done a better job in letting them know that I care about them and being more willing to accept their care. But there will always probably be that little girl inside of me that didn't feel good enough. Like I
Yeah,
definitely still struggle with that. She's always going to be a part of me.
yeah, yeah. And so as you go through the process and you ultimately get convicted and sent to prison, what happens then? What happens for Joybelle then?
So because I had been stealing money, I was able to bond out of jail almost immediately. The next day I bonded out. So I only ever spent one night in county jail. I was out on bond the entire time. So making my quarter, and that process took about a year to go through all of the stuff and all of the speedy trial. My ass, it took a year, right? And so and I, my attorney really sort of, we had talked about, you might go to prison, but he was like, you know what? It's money crime. You're a great candidate for community. Like all along, I had sort of been prepared for, you're probably not going to prison. You're probably going to a halfway house, like make your arrangements. And so that was sort of what I had planned for. And so when the judge ordered me to 8 years in the Department of Corrections, I was shocked, completely shocked, because that's not what we had talked about. That's not what even my attorney had expected. But I was in a county that looked very harshly at economic crime. I was a white woman from the suburbs in my 40s who should have known better, did know better, right? And at least at that time, there was never, because I had never been diagnosed with any mental health stuff, we never talked about that. They didn't care about my abusive history. They didn't care about the domestic violence. Like they didn't, and because I didn't have addiction issues, I've never been an addict with substances, right? Clearly I have other issues that need to be addressed, but the system isn't particularly designed for that. Like substance addiction is easy to solve in some ways. We all know for addicts, it is not, but the system looks at that as quote unquote easier to deal with,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
There's treatment, there's recovery, right? And so for someone like me that has other issues, well, those don't fit into their box. So I never got any, and even in the Department of Corrections, I didn't qualify for any sort of mental health assistance. So that first night was frightening. I had no idea what to expect. I'm back in county jail, right? Because you don't go to DOC right away. There's transfer process. So I'm back in county jail. And because I had only ever spent one night in county jail, I still had no idea what to expect. And again, I don't know how it's like in other states, but here in Colorado, once you're sort of property of DOC, there's a slightly different process. You're housed in a different place, and it's, because you're preparing for transfer. So it's a little different than regular county jail. So I had a slightly better idea what to expect this time of what booking would look like and the concrete and the questions. And, because of that one night, I had a slightly better idea, but now I have this looming Department of Corrections, and what's that going to look like? And how is that going to work? And I believe I spent, I think it was like only 3 days from the time I was sentenced to the time I was transferred to the Department of Corrections. And so I was here, it's called the Reception and Diagnostic Center. And so that's where you go then for strip searches and a delousing shower and taking photos of all of your tattoos and filling out reams of like it is a full day process, right? To be processed into prison. If people don't know that, it is. I think they woke us up around 3 a.m. They didn't actually come and pick us up until 9 or 10 in the morning. And then you're driven around, because what they're doing is, they're doing a transfer and they're picking people up from various prisons and transporting us all to the same place. So it's a lengthy day. And then you're strip searched and deloused and given a uniform and have to get your boots. And like, it's a full, like you're meeting with a ton of different people, and it's line up, wait, and you're being yelled at. And again, you're back in this situation of, well, they expect you to know the process. So if you've never been through it, like I hadn't, and you have no idea what is happening, it's confusing and overwhelming and frightening. And you're afraid of all these people, and you're back to the facade of you can't show any weakness. So you can't ask questions. Like, it's incredibly frightening and, again, dehumanizing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I heard you, speak about the DOC and the things that the system has in place for substance abuse, and not so much for, other causative factors. So how did you deal with, and how did you get help, if you did, with what Joybelle needed while you were incarcerated?
So my first incarceration was 2.5 years inside. And I would say that I didn't get the help I needed. Because I didn't have substance abuse, right? So they couldn't put me in, say, an NA or other recovery. I didn't, because I'd never had a previous diagnosis or on psychotropic meds. I didn't, everything is scored in prison, right? Mm-hmm. So I didn't qualify. I didn't have the proper score level. So any of the mental health classes that I could have taken, like say a seeking safety, which is a trauma class that I desperately wanted because of the trauma in my life, I didn't qualify for. Right. So they weren't going to put me in they have prison overcrowding being what it is. And it is, there's only so many people, there's only so many space in a class. And so the waiting list for classes can be years long, honestly. And on an 8-year DOC sentence, for anyone that doesn't know this, you don't really serve 8 years, right? Generally. I don't know how it is in other states, but here, there's an algebraic formula for how much time you do, and earned time and good time. And there's all of these qualifiers. Well, I wasn't really going to do 8 years of that time. Here in Colorado, you do roughly a third of your time. Well, on an 8-year sentence, that's, 2.5 years. So I didn't have enough time to be waitlisted for some of these classes. And I'm a pretty proactive kind of girl, right? I want to do better, and I'm very achievement oriented, right? There's that worth issue, right? I have to be doing stuff to show I'm worthy. So I got involved in what classes I could. I took 7 Habits. I took a computer class. And on paper, I looked great. I looked I didn't get in trouble. I lived in the incentive unit, you know, had good jobs, was always working. But so on paper, I looked great. The fact of the matter is that I hadn't dealt with the issues I needed to deal with. And so I got out to community corrections. On my first charge, well, I had a second charge that I knew was coming, and I pursued it while I was inside. Well, so I had a DOC sentence, and I also had a community correction sentence. So when I got out, I had 2 sentences to serve. So I had 2 sets of classes, 2 sets of appointments, 2 sets of UAs, 2 sets of restitution. Like I had to double up on everything, and they didn't always agree with each other. Like the DOC, my parole officer, said I could drive because she wanted me working and she didn't want me spending so much time on a bus, for example. The community correction said, oh, no, you're not allowed to drive. Well, which is it? Because I can't do both. Right. And so it was complicated, and it was hard because I'm having to come up with money for 2 sets of stuff and pay my rent, right, and support myself, right. And I remember, I don't have any family. I don't have anybody helping me. So I struggled hard, and I really tried to do it right. And when I couldn't pay my rent, I went to Catholic Charities. I went to Salvation Army. I went to St. Francis, and I was begging for help. And first, sometimes it was, oh, well, you don't have substance abuse issues, so you don't qualify for our program. Oh, you're not a mommy, so you don't qualify for our program. Oh, you don't have an eviction notice yet, so we can't help you. Well, then I did have an eviction notice. Oh, well, we don't have funding now. So I ended up living out of my car. And I ended up, just like anybody else, what do you do when the shit hits the fan and you need money? So just like anybody else, I did what I knew, and I forged payroll checks. First of all, I never should have been in a job where I had access, right? But the halfway house, when I couldn't find any other work because I was grossly overqualified for fast food and call center, right? I used to be a bookkeeper, right? So I couldn't find a job for 3 months. So I'm 3 months behind on my rent. They're getting ready to put me on a financial contract and send me back to prison because I can't find a job, right? That's what I would go back on, not because I reoffended. So the halfway house, the employment coordinator calls somebody she knows, and I get an office job. I'm really good at office jobs. I'm a detail-oriented kind of girl. I'm educated. I used to be a bookkeeper, so I understand sales tax returns and financial, like I get it. Like that was my work. I understand invoicing and P&L and balance sheet, and I understand those things. And so the owner of the company wants to give me a shot. And I really believe that I am not going to steal money again. I believe that I've worked on myself and I don't want to go back to prison. And I believe that I'm a better person, and I want to be. But when the shit hits the fan and my car gets rear-ended and I can't pay my rent because this employer is bouncing payroll checks, and the halfway house tells me that I can't quit my job because then I'll violate my financial contract, even though my parole officer wants me working someplace else. Those 2 organizations, they can't get on the same page about what they want me doing. So I have to keep the job. Well, what do? I forge payroll checks to cover my rent. So I commit another felony, right? I do like anybody else does. I go to what I know. And that's what I did. So I reoffended, right? And went back to prison. So my 12-year ComCore sentence turns into a 12-year DOC sentence. And on my new felony for forgery and theft, I get 9 years. Well, 12 plus 9 all consecutive. So I receive a 21-year sentence in the Department of Corrections for stealing money. So I go back to prison. So I'm now in on my second sentence. Back, and going back to prison is humiliating because on paper, remember, I looked real good, hadn't been in any trouble, had done these programs. And so I go back to, here in Colorado, there's only 2 women's facilities, a maximum and a medium. So because of my security classification, I go back to the medium security facility in Pueblo, and back to officers who knew me, people who remembered me. And what on earth it was, that first day back was humiliating for me, right? Because I have to admit, yeah, I looked good on paper, but I didn't get anywhere near as far as I thought I would.
Yeah.
And then I spent 4.5 years in on that sentence, and here I am.
Hmm. So what did you do in that 4 years to transform, or did you?
I believe I did. I spent a lot of time. So again, because I did not qualify for mental health help, I spent a lot of time doing programs. And I took advantage. This time I had more support. I had friends who would send me in books for me to read. And every week we would have correspondence, mental health chats, right? About what my reading was and what I had learned from it. And that man has since passed away. He passed away while I was in prison. And so it was very interesting that I finally had the support I needed to really help me work on the issues I needed to be working on. So we did a lot of work around my work issues, a lot of work around what I needed to work on. I also took advantage of the cosmetology program and earned my cosmetology license while I was recognizing I need a completely different career field.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I did that. I did the Defy program, which was an 8-month character development and entrepreneurship program. So I took advantage of every program that I could. I stepped into leadership at the prison. I was a peer mentor. I developed a reentry curriculum. I was the pre-release clerk. So I was serving other people, and in doing that, serving myself. And really focused on, I really recognized that first time in prison, I didn't do what I needed to do to really be successful and to really transform my life. So I looked at it. I don't care what your personal spiritual path is, but if you have to go to prison, if you can look at it as a spiritual retreat and really work on what you need to work on, I don't care what your family says, I don't care what your friends say. If you are truly serious about transforming your life, prison can give you the opportunity to do that, right? Because I didn't have to pay rent. I didn't have to find a job. I didn't have to deal with the day-to-day life stuff. I could focus on Joybelle. What does Joybelle need to be a truly functioning, healthy person? And I've got plenty of time to do that. And so I did.
What was the most difficult piece that Joybelle needed and had to work on?
My worth issues. Absolutely. And being willing to be vulnerable and willing to be open. There was an organization that came into the prison. At the time, they were called Authentic Relating. They're now called the Realness Project. And so they work on going into prisons, correctional facilities, and teaching their 5 practices on being open and being vulnerable and how to really pursue connection and communication. And that program was very transformative for me because it I wasn't raised knowing how to communicate well and how to be open and vulnerable. Like in my family, we kept secrets, right? So I didn't know how to do that. And that program in 2 days taught me how to do that and showed me other adults doing that. I had never seen that before. And you don't get that in prison normally, right? People don't communicate well in prison. That's just not how that works. Yeah. And so I just really took advantage of those opportunities and really focused on learning how to do that and stepping into being vulnerable and sharing my story. And every single time I did, as scary as it was, I was rewarded in some way. Like I made a new connection, I made a new friend. I could see the impact my story had on another woman in prison. Like I was a peer educator. Like I met new women as they came into prison. And I recognized that I remembered how frightening it was to come to prison. And by sharing my story and sharing with them in prison, how scared I had been to be there, right? And any of you who've been in prison know that that breaks the convict code. You don't tell people that, right? But every time I did that, I connected with someone. I changed their life. I showed them that even if you come from the streets, even if you are so OG right? You don't have to live that life anymore. You
Yeah.
can be different if you want to be. Yeah, there's a lot of work to it. You're going to have to put in some serious work, but if you're willing to do the work, there are rewards. And so every time I got vulnerable, every time I opened up, every time I shared, even right now, right? Like, would we be having this conversation if I hadn't reached out and said, hey, I'm willing to share my story? No, we wouldn't be. So every time you get vulnerable, every time you're willing to share, as scary and as hard as it is, walk through that fear, because something amazing is on the other side of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that.
Yeah, you heard it here, folks, from Joybelle Phelan. The fear, the willingness to walk through the fear and be vulnerable, there generally is great reward on the other side of that journey. What, if anything, can you identify, in your personal opinion, if there is one, a more common theme or thread that a lot of women who are incarcerated, issues that they have in common?
I believe that many women in prison end up there behind addiction issues and unhealthy relationships, whether it's a romantic relationship or a family relationship. I met many women while I was incarcerated that were there behind something that had happened in a romantic relationship, right? Behind
Yeah.
a man, they had, and for whatever reason, they allowed, right, their own worth issues, their own struggles, their own mental health, put them in a position where they allowed behavior that wasn't healthy, that wasn't okay, that wasn't safe. And maybe they took charges that weren't really theirs, or maybe they made choices that in a different healthy frame of mind they never would have made, but they did. And the consequence of that action was addiction, crime, shame, right? And I think women have, human beings as a whole, right? We deserve dignity and respect. And prison strips that away from you. And so whether you're a man or a woman in prison, you deal with feeling dehumanized and demoralized, lonely and forgotten behind the concrete and barbed wire. But women have a different set of needs. Women typically are more caretakers, right? More nurturers, sadly more involved in their children's lives as much as the fathers want to be. Often there's a different dynamic there. And women have different needs, and gender responsive thinking is newer, but still hasn't trickled down to the actual prison. And so I think part of what I want to do is illustrate for people what it's like for a woman in prison and how we're treated. And we're not simply smaller versions of men receiving the same things that men get, which is often what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if more people knew how their tax dollars were spent, and if more people understood what it was like behind bars, things would probably and also the barriers to reentry, right?
Mm-hmm.
In my own journey for reentry, I have seen so many more options for men than for women. And I'm a proactive kind of girl, remember? So I have sought those out, and there just aren't that many. Why not? Women make up half the population, right? We're just as important as men. I'm not saying men or women better. I'm not saying better or worse, different. And that's okay. But that means those needs need to be addressed too.
Yeah. Yeah. What if you had a magic wand and you could wave it, what is the one thing that you would change about how women are treated in prison?
Oh, one thing. Boy, after being in prison, of course, I see so many issues. But the one thing I would love to slow down, prison is not the answer, whether you're a man or a woman. Prison is not always the answer. There needs to be more avenues for treatment. maybe more diversion programs before you get to prison. I'm not saying that prison shouldn't exist. There are some people, some crimes, some instances where maybe prison is absolutely necessary, right? Remember, I wouldn't have stopped stealing without going to prison. But in general, if you have addiction issues, if you have other mental health traumas, prison should not be the first answer. And how we are treated in prison. Yes, I did something wrong. Yes, I deserve the consequences of my actions, but I don't deserve to be treated as less than a human being.
Yeah. I don't know that we have many people who listen to this podcast who would disagree with that.
I don't think so, but I think the biggest, it's great to feel like you want to help people in prison. And I salute that. That's a beautiful thing. But what are you doing besides listening to this podcast? What are you doing besides talking to your neighbor? There needs, please, to be some sort of call to action. How are you helping someone as they get out of prison? Are you volunteering in a prison if that's possible? Are you writing someone? Do you have any idea how lonely it is to be sitting behind the walls and never get mail? Never get a card of, for crying out loud, it could be a postcard that says thinking of you. Like, I don't care what it is, but to never get any mail, that's so isolating. We already feel forgotten about in prison because life moves on incredibly fast. You go to work every day and you take care of your kids and you pay your bills and you go to the soccer game and whatever your life is, right? Yes, you are incredibly busy. But do you have 5 minutes to send somebody a postcard and let them know they're not forgotten? They're not warehoused, that they as a human being matter to someone? So what else are you doing besides listening to this podcast?
Yeah. I got one more thing for you, if you can and if you're willing to. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and see in your mind's eye 6-year-old little Joybelle. And knowing everything that you know now and having experienced everything that you've experienced up to this point, I'm going to ask you to pick her up and give her a piece of advice.
Oh, I would tell her that you're going to have some bumps and bruises along the way. And it's going to be harder than you ever thought possible. But at the end of the day, not at the end of the day, when you are 47 years old and you're leaving prison for the last time, you have an opportunity to help other people and shine your light and be the best version of yourself. And it will someday all be worth it.
Nice. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with that we may not have covered today?
No, I think we've covered a lot. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you listening. And please, pay attention to the stories, right? Like, go to the Prison Journalism Project or the SE Project, or find one of these organizations in your town that's helping people in prison, helping with reentry, helping, right, educate people, and find a somewhere in your town where you can help someone, because you don't have to have a degree. You don't have to have any special training. You just have to have the want to care for someone and show a piece of humanity to somebody that really needs it.
Showing some humanity. I like that. Well, thank you, Joybelle. It's been an honor and a privilege, and we definitely appreciate having you here. And once again, welcome home and congratulations at a second chance at a first class life.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am.